The dress was the color of bleached bone. It hung in the oppressive heat of Sterling's mercantile, a stark white promise in a world of dust and sweat. Leanne traced its hem with her eyes, her fingers hovering just above the delicate cotton lace. For a moment, she was not the daughter of the town's Chinese laundryman, a silent figure in a gray Cheongsam who moved through the streets like a ghost. For a moment, she was a bride. The thought was a fragile bird in her chest, fluttering its wings. She had saved for months, each coin a small victory against the town's casual disregard, a secret hoard kept in a small porcelain jar. Today, she had enough. Her heart beat a steady, hopeful rhythm against her ribs as she finally reached out, her slender fingers closing around the fabric. It was real. It was possible. The bell above the door remained silent, the other patrons frozen in their browsing, their attention drawn by a current of impending cruelty. Vance Sterling stood behind his polished counter, a man whose worth was measured in inventory and accounts. He watched her, a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. He let the silence stretch, letting the weight of every eye in the room press down on the small, solitary figure in gray. He enjoyed the theater of it, the slow, delicious turning of the screw. He polished a glass with a clean cloth, his movements deliberate and condescending, each circular wipe a small act of power. He knew what she wanted. He had seen her looking at the dress for weeks. "Something you need?" Sterling's voice cut through the thick air, loud and overly cordial, the sound of a trap being sprung. Leanne flinched but did not look up from the dress. She held it out slightly, a silent offering. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, a sound as soft as the material she held. "I would like to buy this." The words hung in the air, audacious and impossible to the silent onlookers. Sterling threw back his head and laughed. It was not a sound of mirth. It was a weapon, sharp and ugly, designed to flay the hope from her skin. "Buy it?" he boomed, slapping the counter for emphasis. The few other customers, a rancher's wife, a pair of dusty prospectors, shuffled uncomfortably, their eyes darting away. They were witnesses, but not participants. "Child, that dress is for a proper wedding, for a lady. It costs more than your father makes in a month of scrubbing miner's trousers." The cruelty was methodical, precise. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial sneer. "What would someone like you possibly do with a dress like that?" Leanne's hand did not tremble. She slowly, carefully folded the dress and placed it back on the display table. Her movements were a study in grace, a stark contrast to the merchant's vulgar display. She did not run. She did not cry. She met his gaze, her dark eyes holding a depth he could not comprehend, an ancient sorrow and an unyielding strength. She said nothing. The silence that followed was more damning than any shouted retort. She turned, her gray silk dress rustling faintly, and walked out of the store, leaving Sterling standing in the wreckage of his own laughter. The oppressive summer sun hit her face, but it felt no hotter than the shame that had filled the room behind her. In the far corner of the mercantile, half hidden behind a stack of flour sacks, Jedediah Vance had seen it all. He was a man carved from the silence of the high plains, his face weathered by sun and wind, his eyes accustomed to watching the slow turn of seasons and the subtle shifts of the horizon. He rarely came to town, preferring the company of his cattle in the vast, empty sky. But a broken harness had forced his hand, and he had found himself a reluctant observer to an act of casual brutality that left a sour taste in his mouth. He watched Leanne as she faced the shopkeeper. He saw the flicker of hope in her eyes when she first touched the dress, and he saw the way she extinguished it herself, like snuffing a candle, when Sterling began his assault. What struck him was not her hurt, but her stillness. She possessed a dignity that seemed alien in this dusty, loud world. It was a quiet strength, a resilience forged in a fire he could only imagine. While others shuffled their feet and looked away, complicit in their silence, Jedediah watched, and in watching, he became a judge. He saw Sterling, a man puffed up with the importance of his possessions, his power derived from shelves of tinned goods and bolts of cloth, and he saw the girl, whose only possession in that moment was her own composure, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, which of them was truly rich. He felt a coil of shame tighten in his own gut for his inaction. He was not a man of many words, and the thought of speaking up in that crowded room had paralyzed him. But his silence now felt like a betrayal, not just of her, but of a fundamental decency that the world seemed determined to grind into dust. After she left, the atmosphere in the store shifted. The air, once thick with tension, now felt stale and ashamed. Sterling, his performance over, went back to polishing his glass, a self-satisfied smirk still lingering on his face. Jedediah bought his leather straps and rivets, his transaction curt and wordless. He walked out into the blinding sunlight. The image of the girl's quiet retreat burned into his mind. The white dress, left behind on the table, seemed to hold the moment's lingering poison. He did not know her name, but he knew he would not forget her face. The sun of that summer became a tyrant. It beat down on the parched earth until the ground cracked like old pottery, and the air shimmered with a heat that felt solid enough to touch. Dust, fine as silt, coated everything, turning the green of the sparse foliage to a uniform, defeated gray. It was a season of endurance, a test of will against the relentless indifference of the sky. For Vance Sterling, the drought was good for business. His mercantile became the town's lifeline, its shelves holding the promise of survival. People paid his inflated prices for flour, for salted meat, for the water he had hauled in and stored in his massive cistern. His wealth grew with every desperate purchase, and his arrogance swelled with it. He was the king of a thirsty kingdom, and he never let anyone forget it. Leanne, too, endured. She worked alongside her father in the suffocating heat of their small laundry, the steam rising in ghostly clouds around them. Her hands were perpetually chapped, her knuckles raw from lye soap and boiling water, but her movements remained fluid and efficient. She was a fixture in the town's landscape, as constant as the heat itself, moving with a quiet purpose that drew no attention. She fetched water, hung sheets that billowed like white flags of surrender against the brassy sky, and returned to the steam, her face serene and unreadable. Jedediah saw her often on his infrequent trips into town. His own ranch was suffering. The creek that fed his pastures had dwindled to a muddy trickle, and his cattle grew lean, their ribs stark beneath their hides. He was forced to buy feed from Sterling, each sack a small humiliation that cost him more than just coin. On these trips, his path would sometimes cross Leanne's. A silent nod was all that ever passed between them, a brief acknowledgment in a world that otherwise rendered her invisible. But in those fleeting moments he saw the same stillness, the same deep well of strength he had witnessed in the store. It was a shared language of survival, spoken in the space between glances. He saw the weariness in her eyes, but also the unbroken spirit behind them. He began to look for her, to anticipate that quiet moment of connection, a silent testament that they were both still standing against the harshness of the season. The sky had been a merciless, unbroken blue for so long that when the clouds finally gathered, they seemed like an invading army. They massed over the distant mountains, bruised and purple, building for days until the air grew heavy and still, charged with a strange electric anticipation. The rain, when it came, was not the gentle, life-giving shower the town had prayed for. It was a biblical deluge, a violent unburdening of the heavens. Water fell in solid, roaring sheets, hammering rooftops and turning the dusty streets into raging rivers of mud. The hard-baked earth could not absorb the sudden onslaught, and the water, with nowhere to go, sought the lowest ground. It found Sterling's mercantile. The torrent, channeled by the town's main street, slammed into his storefront, shattering the large glass windows he had been so proud of. Water surged through the building, a brown, churning beast that lifted crates, toppled shelves, and submerged a lifetime of accumulated inventory in a swirl of mud and debris. From his ranch on the higher ground, Jedediah watched the storm unleash its fury. The water that was destroying the town below was, for him, a salvation. It filled his dry creek bed, soaked into his thirsty pastures, and revealed things long hidden. When the deluge finally subsided, it left behind a world remade. The lower part of town was a ruin, a landscape of mud and loss. Sterling stood amidst the wreckage of his empire, his fine suit stained, his face a mask of disbelief. The flood had washed away more than his goods. It had washed away his certainty, his arrogance, his place at the top of the town's fragile hierarchy. His kingdom of dry goods had been conquered by mud. He was just another man, standing in the ruin of his life, the laughter he had so freely dispensed, now a bitter memory in a town that had other, more immediate concerns than his pride. The very element everyone had begged for had proven to be his undoing, a brutal lesson in the whims of nature and the impermanence of fortune. As the waters receded and the sun emerged to bake the sodden earth, the town began to assess its new reality. For Vance Sterling, it was a landscape of total loss. His inventory was a swollen, ruined mass of spoiled food and waterlogged fabric. The very foundation of his store was compromised, the adobe bricks dissolving back into the mud from which they were made. His wealth, so solid and tangible just days before, had proven to be as fleeting as a rain cloud. He was a man adrift, his power and influence gone, leaving only a desperate, hollowed-out man in their place. But for Jedediah Vance, the flood was a genesis. The torrent of water that had destroyed Sterling's business had blessed his land. New springs, unearthed by the scouring force of the flood, bubbled up from the ground, promising a future of lush grass for his cattle. More than that, the water had stripped away a top layer of soil on a low hill, revealing a deep, rich deposit of clay. It was a vein of pure red earth, perfect for making bricks. Strong, durable bricks, the very things the town would need to rebuild itself from the mud. Jedediah, a man who understood the earth, recognized the gift he had been given. He spent his days not lamenting, but working. With his own hands he built a simple but effective kiln, firing a test batch of bricks that emerged from the heat hard as stone and the color of the sunset. His wealth was no longer just in the cattle he raised, but in the very ground beneath his feet. While Sterling clawed through the muck of his ruined store, trying to salvage stained ribbons and dented tins, Jedediah was creating the foundation of the town's future. His power was not in what he sold, but in what he could make. He was no longer just a solitary rancher. He was the architect of the town's renewal, a quiet, unassuming man who now held the key to its survival. The balance of power had shifted, not with the exchange of money, but with the raw, elemental force of the earth itself. The world had turned upside down. Vance Sterling, who had once stood behind a polished counter looking down on the world, now stood with his hat in his hands on another man's land, the dust of humility coating his fine boots. He had come to Jedediah's ranch as a supplicant. His attempts to secure lumber and materials from outside suppliers had failed. His credit, once unimpeachable, had vanished with his inventory. The only source for the bricks he desperately needed to rebuild his store, his life, was the quiet rancher standing before him now. "Vance," Jedediah said, his voice even, betraying no emotion. He did not offer the man a seat. He simply stood, his presence as solid and unyielding as the hills behind him. Sterling, flustered and stripped of his usual bluster, began to stammer. "I need bricks, Jedediah. A great many, to rebuild. The town needs the mercantile." He tried to frame his personal desperation as a civic necessity. "I can't pay right away, of course, but once I'm back on my feet..." He let the sentence trail off, the plea hanging in the dry air between them. Jedediah listened, his gaze steady. He remembered the look on Sterling's face as he had mocked Leanne, the casual cruelty of it. He said nothing for a long moment, letting Sterling squirm in the silence. During these weeks of rebuilding, Jedediah had sought out Leanne. He found her not in the steam-filled laundry, but by the river, where she went in the evenings to watch the water flow. He didn't come with grand words or empty pleasantries. He came with small offerings from his land, a hawk's feather, a strangely shaped river stone, a sprig of wild sage whose scent perfumed the air. He sat with her, sometimes in silence, simply sharing the space as the sky turned from blue to orange to deep violet. He learned the cadence of her quietness, the language of her small gestures. Paused, turning to look at her. Paused, turning to look at her. Her profile serene in the twilight. "It will need someone to make it a home. I was hoping that someone would be you." He asked for her hand, not with a flourish, but with the simple, solid promise of a shared life. Leanne looked at Jedediah, her dark eyes reflecting the nascent starlight. She saw in his weathered face not the pity or condescension she had grown so accustomed to, but a deep and abiding respect. He was a man who spoke through his hands, through his connection to the earth, and in his quiet presence she felt a sense of peace she had never known. He did not see her as a fragile china doll or an exotic creature. He saw her, simply and completely. Her acceptance was as quiet as his proposal, a small, almost imperceptible nod, and a softness in her eyes that was more eloquent than any word. The next day Jedediah sealed his deal with Sterling, agreeing to provide the bricks on credit, a decision that baffled the few who heard of it. But Jedediah's motives were his own, part of a plan that was slowly taking shape. Later that week he went to Leanne. "A bride should have a proper dress," he said gently, careful not to stir the painful memory. "Whatever you want, I will get it for you." Leanne's gaze drifted towards the town, towards the ruined mercantile. A shadow passed over her face, so fleeting Jedediah might have missed it if he hadn't been watching so closely. She did not mention the white dress, the symbol of her public humiliation, but he saw the ghost of it in her eyes. He knew. Without another word to her, he went into town. Sterling's ruin was a chaotic mess of salvaged goods and debris. Jedediah found the merchant trying to clean a stack of warped wooden crates. He asked about the dress. Sterling, confused, shrugged. "Probably ruined, washed away." But Jedediah was persistent. He pointed to a pile of mud-caked textiles in a corner. "Let me look through that." After several minutes of digging through the foul-smelling pile, he found it. The white dress, stained a dirty brown, the delicate lace torn and matted with filth. It was a pathetic, forgotten thing. "I'll take it," Jedediah said. Sterling, bewildered, named a price that was an insult to its original cost. Jedediah paid it without haggling and carried the ruined dress away, a bundle of muddy cloth that held more meaning than Sterling could ever comprehend. Jedediah did not take the dress to his future home. Instead, he carried the mud-stained bundle to the small, clean building that housed the town laundry. He presented it to Leanne's father, a man as quiet and dignified as his daughter. The old man took the dress, his knowing eyes meeting Jedediah's, a silent understanding passing between them. This was not just about cleaning a garment. It was about restoring honor. Leanne was there, and when she saw the dress, her face remained a calm mask, but her hands, for the first time, trembled slightly. The work began that evening. It became a ritual, a quiet act of reclamation. Leanne and her father worked together, their movements synchronized and purposeful. They soaked the dress in a special mixture of gentle soap and rainwater, painstakingly working the mud from every fiber, every fold, every delicate loop of lace. The process was slow and methodical. Each stain that lifted, each bit of grime that washed away, felt like a small victory over the memory of Sterling's laughter. It was a baptism, cleansing the dress not only of mud, but of the humiliation that had clung to it. Jedediah would come in the evenings, after his own long day of making bricks. He would not speak, not wanting to intrude on their silent, focused work. He would simply sit on the stool in the corner, watching Leanne's hands as she worked with such care and precision. He saw the strength in her slender fingers, the unwavering focus in her eyes. He would bring them food, a freshly baked loaf of bread, a stew he had cooked over his fire. They would eat together in the warm, lamp-lit room, the air thick with the clean scent of soap and damp cotton. In these quiet hours, their bond deepened, woven together by shared purpose and unspoken affection. The dress, slowly returning to its original luminous white under Leanne's patient care, became a testament to her resilience. It was no longer a symbol of what she could not have, but a symbol of what she could restore, what she could create from wreckage. It was becoming her own. The day of the wedding was bright and clear, the sky a newly washed blue. The town was a hive of activity, the sounds of hammers and saws filling the air as people worked to rebuild what the flood had taken. Leanne emerged from her father's home, and a hush fell over the few who saw her. She wore the white dress. It was no longer just a dress, it was a marvel. It shone with a brilliance that seemed to come from within, purer and brighter than it had ever been on Sterling's shelf. The lace, painstakingly repaired, was perfect. In her dark hair she wore a single white wildflower Jedediah had picked for her that morning. She was a vision of grace and quiet triumph. Jedediah stood waiting for her, his usual rugged work clothes replaced by a simple, clean suit. He looked at her, and his face, usually so stoic, broke into a rare, genuine smile. He took her arm, his touch gentle and protective, and instead of heading towards the small, makeshift chapel, he began to walk her towards the center of town, towards the construction, towards the noise and the dust. He led her directly to the site of the ruined mercantile, where a new foundation of red bricks, his bricks, was being laid. Vance Sterling was there, his fine clothes gone, replaced by the practical trousers and shirt of a laborer. He was covered in sweat and grime, directing the workers, his voice strained with the effort of trying to claw his way back from ruin. He was so consumed with his task that he didn't notice them until they were standing right in front of him. He looked up, wiping sweat from his brow, his eyes blinking in the harsh sunlight. He saw Jedediah first, and then he saw Leanne. His eyes widened as they fell upon the white dress. Recognition dawned, followed by a wave of disbelief. He looked from the radiant woman to the dress and back again, his mind struggling to connect the pristine garment with the mud-caked rag he had sold for pennies. The hammers fell silent. The sawing stopped. Every worker on the site turned to watch, a silent audience to a drama that had begun months ago. The silence in the middle of the construction site was absolute. It was a vacuum, drawing in all the ambient sound and leaving only the heavy, thudding beat of three hearts. Sterling stared, his mouth slightly agape, the color draining from his face. The woman standing before him in that impossibly white dress was the same one he had scorned, the same ghost-like figure he had dismissed with a laugh. But she was transformed. Her quietness was no longer the meekness of the downtrodden. It was the profound stillness of a mountain. Beside her stood Jedediah Vance, the man who now owned the very earth on which Sterling hoped to rebuild his life. Jedediah's gaze was not angry. It was not hateful. It was something far more devastating. It was calm, level, and deeply disappointed. He did not need to raise his voice. The power had already shifted, the verdict already rendered by fate. He let the silence hang for a moment longer, allowing the full weight of the scene to settle upon Sterling, to sear itself into the memory of every man watching. Then Jedediah spoke. His voice was low, carrying easily in the stillness, each word chosen with deliberate, crushing weight. "You laughed at my bride." It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact, a simple, unadorned truth that landed with the force of a landslide. The words echoed with the memory of that hot, shameful afternoon in the Mercantile. They held the sting of Sterling's mockery, the pain of Leanne's silent dignity, and the long, slow turning of justice. Sterling visibly flinched, as if struck. His eyes darted around at the faces of the workers, seeing in them the reflection of his own past arrogance. He saw no sympathy, only the dispassionate judgment of witnesses. He looked back at Leanne, at her serene face, and for the first time he saw her not as an object of his scorn, but as a human being whose worth he had been utterly blind to. The foundation of his world, already washed away by the flood, crumbled completely. His knees buckled and he sank down into the dust and brick chips of his own ruined dream. It was not a plea for forgiveness or a theatrical display of remorse. It was the quiet, absolute collapse of a man hollowed out by his own cruelty. Jedediah watched him for a second longer, then gently turned Leanne and led her away from the wreckage, walking toward the open plains and the promise of the home they would build together, leaving the fallen man to his reckoning in the silent judgment of the town.